Jeff, it's so great to see you. Thanks so much for joining me at the Conversation Corner. I want to start with things that are very recent, like today, this morning. President Trump on Truth Social said something about his powers as regards elections, and that flows directly through our Constitution. He wrote, "Remember, the states are merely an agent for the federal government in counting and tabulating the votes. They must do what the federal government, as represented by the President of the United States, tells them." That's not my reading of the Constitution when the clause, time, manner, and place cycles through my memory.
You're absolutely right. And it's so striking that the decision to leave primary control over election to the states was the fundamental choice of the original framers. Congress has limited control over election. It can set the time, place, and manner, but the details of who gets to vote and when, if Congress doesn't intervene, and how to count are all left up to the states, which is why we have 50 different systems. During Reconstruction, Congress could have nationalized elections, but they didn't, and that's led to so many of the election disputes ever since. It really is remarkable how many basic democratic choices remain at the state level in America, and we do not have a tradition of national control.
Especially not flowing through any president. Because if there was anything that was debated hotly, and many things were at that time, after the Constitution was ratified and in the early stages of the presidency, it was, is this office dictatorial or not? Does it exert extraordinary political power over the will of the people?
I have a new book coming out about the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson throughout American history. It begins with the following scene. Dinner at Jefferson's house. Washington's away. The cabinet is gathered. At some point, Hamilton says to Jefferson, "Who are those three guys on the wall?" Jefferson says, "Those are my three portraits of the greatest men in history, John Locke, Francis Bacon, and Isaac Newton." Hamilton pauses, and then he blurts out, "The greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar." So Jefferson writes in his diary, this proves that Hamilton is for a monarchy bottomed on corruption, and he wants to resurrect Caesar in America. Now, it's an amazing story because Hamilton is almost certainly joking. He fears Julius Caesar running in at the head of Shays' rebellion and being a demagogue who will foment anarchy from below. Jefferson fears a Caesar from above. And both of them unite to oppose Aaron Burr, who they fear is a would-be Caesar who wants to lead an insurrection and install himself as a dictator. The point is that the fear of Caesarism is the central concern. It's the reason that the Constitution is designed to avoid concentrating all power in one man. And although Hamilton and Jefferson disagree about how strong to make the executive, they are both determined to prevent a resurrection of King George.
And that is so much a part of our conversation right now because this administration not only has the unitary executive, but it roots it in, among other things, Federalist 70, in which Alexander Hamilton says, and I'll read it right here, "Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government." This administration says Hamilton and others wanted an aggressive executive, energetic. And that's how they justify so many of the things they've done the second time around.
It's absolutely right that Hamilton wants an energetic executive, and he has been invoked throughout American history to support an energetic executive. But he does not want a king or a sovereign. Hamilton is crucial that the impeachment power will check corrupt executives, and he does not think that the president initially should have unchecked power to fire all executive officials. He has an unusual solution to his fears of Caesar. He wants a president elected for life, so the president won't be tempted to be corrupted. Jefferson wants the opposite, a president who could only have one term so that he won't be tempted to install himself in office. And there's an amazing letter that Jefferson writes to Madison when he first gets a copy of the Constitution. He says, "I'm afraid because the president can run again, a future president might lose an election by a few votes, refuse to leave office, and install himself as a dictator." So in other words, both of them are afraid of this unchecked executive. And although there's a long and honorable debate throughout American history about how strong the president should be, neither of them wants unchecked power.
And this country has experienced loud, contentious arguments about a king-like president. Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, FDR, Nixon in certain respects, and certainly now with President Trump.
Absolutely. And this fear of Caesarism is prevalent. And in fact, FDR is attacked so often as Caesar that he dresses up like Julius Caesar for his birthday, and Eleanor dresses up like a Roman matron, and he kind of makes fun of the whole thing. So there's a very honorable tradition in America of fearing concentrated presidential power. But the point is, separation of powers is the fundamental constitutional principle. The president's not a king. We, the people, have the sovereign power. No one branch of government can speak for our name, and it's urgently important to prevent an aspiring dictator who would consolidate all power in his own hands.
You know right now that there is a tremendous op-ed debate going on in this country about whether or not we're at a tipping point about that very thing you just described.
In the Hamilton-Jefferson book, I say there is a very important debate right now about whether President Trump is Julius Caesar or Andrew Jackson. His supporters say this is the resurrection of Jackson, a populist who used executive power to shrink the size of the federal government, but ultimately to serve the people's will. President Trump's critics say this is the fulfillment of the founders' fears. For the first time since Aaron Burr, we have a president who wants to call off democratic elections and concentrate power in his own hands. It's too soon to decide. History needs time. But it's really important to study this history, to recognize that this debate about preventing Caesar has been the fundamental debate in American history, so that citizens can make up their own minds.
And to that point about citizens making up their own mind, it has also been written somewhat recently that it is the citizenry that needs to call this out, and not, that is to say, the citizenry sit back and rely on district courts or Congress to check this. Yes, they are there to check in certain ways, but if the country doesn't rise up and find its own voice, the president's going to keep pushing. Any president's going to keep pushing.
All the founders thought that civic virtue was necessary for the republic to survive. Otherwise, we'd go the way of Greece and Rome, where citizens surrendered their liberties to Caesar in exchange for cheap luxuries and bread and circus and entertainment. And what do they mean by civic virtue? They meant citizens studying the Constitution, studying history, so that they could make up their own minds. They did not expect that everyone would agree about the right balance, but they felt we all have a duty, a responsibility to inform ourselves so we can decide.
Also talking about things happening right now, I think many Americans who maybe only thought about immigration powers vested in the federal government casually are surprised to learn how deeply entrenched they are. And the president is exercising a lot of aggressive sway, but more or less within the way the Constitution defined the federal government's role in this particular space.
That's absolutely right. Unlike power over elections, which are essentially state-based, control over immigration is absolutely in the federal government. Congress has essentially plenary authority to set immigration policy. It's delegated huge enforcement power to the president. And although his power is not unlimited, for example, all persons in the United States are entitled to due process of law, and you cannot be taken off the streets and deported without due process, whether you're a citizen or a non-citizen alike. Nevertheless, the president does have huge power to decide who to let in, and he's exercising that right now.
And back to this due process, the Constitution also says all persons must be counted in a census. Both of those things are now under pressure from this administration. Due process and counting everyone, even though the Constitution is very clear on both.
It is. The U.S. Supreme Court had some important pushback against efforts to change the census requirements in the first Trump administration because the Constitution is so clear, and it couldn't be clearer about due process. That is the right of all persons.
What about birthright citizenship? What does the Constitution say? What did it mean to say? How has it been interpreted since?
The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Ever since that was adopted in 1868, courts have interpreted it to mean that if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen, period, with the exception of Native Americans who didn't originally pay tax and the kids of foreign ambassadors. With those two exceptions, the words, all persons born or naturalized or citizens, has been interpreted to include everyone, regardless of whether your parents are citizens or even here legally. Now, the Trump administration has taken a different view of that clause. The U.S. Supreme Court is in the middle of deciding when to issue a definitive resolution. Predictions are difficult, but it's fair to say that the overwhelming consensus of legal scholars, liberal and conservative alike, is that the current law is clear, and many people expect the U.S. Supreme Court to reaffirm birthright citizenship.
Where do you think we are in our understanding of what this Supreme Court is ideologically, how it's constructed? There's plenty of argumentation made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that the court was a liberal majority and its interpretation of the Constitution got ahead of what was attainable at the ballot box. Is there a blowback constitutionally against that?
There's no question that this is a conservative court. People have run the numbers and found that it comes down on conservative sides strikingly. But there are important divisions among the conservatives. Chief Justice John Roberts is a Hamiltonian. He favors broad congressional power, and that's why he broke with the other conservatives in upholding Obamacare, because he thinks Congress should have a lot of power. Justice Antonin Scalia was more Hamiltonian, and he said, I'm not a strict constructionist, and he wanted to uphold broad congressional power too. By contrast, Justice Clarence Thomas is a Jeffersonian. He wanted to strike down Obamacare. He wanted to prevent the regulation of medical marijuana at the federal level, and he wants to strike down much of the post-New Deal administrative state. We're also seeing important divisions among the conservatives about strict and liberal construction. That's the essential debate. It's not originalism versus non-originalism. It's that old debate between Hamilton and Jefferson over, do you have the power to charter the national bank? Hamilton says implied powers, liberal construction. Jefferson says it has to be enumerated, and strict construction. And we're seeing the same division on the court today.
Jay Cost was on this program a couple of weeks ago, and we had a conversation about what do we understand broadly in our country about how we began. And it was his belief, and I like your interpretation of this, that our civic vocabulary exists in a state of impoverishment. We know terms, we know words, but we don't understand or have not brought into ourselves the genuine meaning of them and where we all got started, meaning we don't know our origins as much as our language might suggest we do. Agree or disagree?
Completely agree. It is so striking when you read history how much more deeply read in history our previous presidents were. One thing that blew me away when writing about Hamilton and Jefferson is the fact that so many of our previous presidents read and even wrote books about the Hamilton-Jefferson debate. John Quincy Adams traces the rise of America's political parties back to the initial division between Hamilton and Jefferson. Martin Van Buren writes the first political history of the United States and traces it back to the Hamilton-Jefferson debate. James Garfield reads the collected works of Hamilton in the law library and leads a Hamiltonian revival in the Gilded Age. Theodore Roosevelt writes a biography of Gouverneur Morris, of all people, who he thinks is a great hero and calls himself both a Hamiltonian and a Jeffersonian. FDR reads a book by Claude Bowers called Jefferson versus Hamilton and has Bowers speak to the Democratic Convention in the early 30s and reinvents the Democratic Party as the party of Jeffersonian democracy. And then even the modern presidents, George W. Bush read Ron Cherno's Hamilton biography. Obama quoted it in his speech at Cooper Union. And I haven't even mentioned the books that Wilson, Taft, and Teddy Roosevelt wrote. So I actually find this quite inspiring. It's striking what a high level of civic discourse we had through much of American history, because our presidents and our congresspeople and our citizens were deep readers. They didn't all have fancy education. Lincoln, of course, is reading in his log cabin. Mm-hmm. Frederick Douglass also. They read the Bible, they read Shakespeare, they read history. And it's really an inspiring challenge to all of us just to start reading again. We're so addicted to these screens. I'll just speak for myself, that getting back into the habit of deep daily reading and digging, it's so exciting. The more history you learn, the more informed you are. And I think it's absolutely right that unless we really dig in deeply and learn from the complexities of our history, our civic discourse is going to remain impoverished.
Scrolling's not going to get us there.
I have to say, I think we talked about this last time. I had this weird COVID-era reading project where I spent a year reading classical moral philosophy in order to resurrect the founders' original understanding of the pursuit of happiness, not as feeling good but being good, not the pursuit of pleasure but the pursuit of virtue. The takeaway for me after spending a year getting up before sunrise and reading Cicero is I'm not doing that anymore. But my rule is when I wake up in the morning, I have to read before I can browse or surf. And it's totally changed my life. I wrote another book. I'm learning something every day. Reading a book. And we all know what the difference between a book and a blog is. I do read on Kindle because it just blows my mind that all the books in the world are kind of free and online. All I need is the self-discipline to swipe right to the book and not left to the cat videos, and it's totally transformative. So let's all recommit to deep reading.
So here's an example of terminology. If I say to a garden variety, well-read conservative, we live in a democracy, that well-read conservative man or woman will say, no, we don't. We live in a constitutional republic, and you ought to know the difference. I used to have these conversations 20 years ago. I have since learned the difference. Correct?
Yes, correct. Most of the founders of the Constitutional Convention fear pure democracy. They've seen Shays' Rebellion, where the farmers in western Massachusetts are mobbing the courthouse. They've read ancient history that says that pure democracies like Greece and Rome degenerate to demagogues, and they want a mixed government. By a republic, they mean government by consent that's ultimately popularly accountable, but not susceptible to direct democracy. And in fact, the anti-democratic strains of the convention were resisted by people like Jefferson, who's much more in favor of broad suffrage, no property requirements, and extending the right to vote to poor white men. Of course, he has glaring exceptions. But that history is important to learn. And maybe the founders were right, maybe they were wrong, but they studied history and they were not fans of pure democracy.
And in that same context, when I would talk to a well-read liberal or progressive man or woman, they would say, true, but without the cauldron of democracy, meaning the will of the people, the defects of the Constitution and our origins of our constitutional republic would not have been remedied. Suffrage wouldn't have been obtained by women. Suffrage would not have been obtained by African Americans. We would not have remedied the defects had it not been for the will of the people expressed through democratic means.
Absolutely. And that was Jefferson's ultimate point, that majorities must ultimately rule in a country where we the people are sovereign. And the promise of the Declaration, liberty, equality, and government by consent, was slowly but meaningfully extended to previously excluded groups to make it more embracive. That was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's word, and it's a beautiful word, embracing the previously left out groups so that they too could claim the benefits of full citizenship.
I talk to friends in and outside of Washington who feel unnerved about this particular period of time. And it's not anything to do with COVID. It's just that they feel like things are unsettled and things that they had assumed were static and preserved and preservable feel up for grabs, legally, constitutionally, within our politics. Does it feel that way to you?
These are testing times, and there's no doubt that changes in technology and politics, in particular, the rise of social media and the rise of polarization, have created versions of the founders' nightmare, where posts based on passion travel further and faster than those based on reason, and the entire Enlightenment faith that it's possible to create a republic based on reason and conviction, not force or violence, which is the challenge in Federalist One, is all up for grabs. That's why it's so important to return to first principles, in particular to study the principles of the Constitution and the Declaration, not because we're all going to agree, because the whole point of those principles is to structure our disagreement. We're not supposed to all come to the same conclusion, but it's the commitment to civil dialogue that's necessary for the system to work. There's an amazing truth that after Hamilton dies in the duel, Jefferson places a bust of Hamilton across from his own bust in the central entrance hall of Monticello. You can see it when you go there today. And when he'd pass it, he would smile and say, opposed in life as in death. And he saw Hamilton not as a hated enemy to be destroyed, but a respected adversary to be engaged with. And it's the engagement with the other side that's crucial. And the danger now is we're not engaging, we're not listening. We have our filter bubbles and our echo chambers. We're more polarized than at any time since the Civil War. It is so important to recommit to debating the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution so we can sustain them.
And as we engage in that debate, I am reminded that when radio was racing across the land as a new medium, these fears were expressed and articulated. When television was taking over the way politicians communicated, these fears were animated and part of the conversation. Is this just the latest technological phase?
It's really true that fears about democracy have tracked technology, going back to the rise of the telegraph, and before that, the broadside press. But there is a difference in the technology. Madison thought this new printing technology, the broadside press, would save democracy because citizens would read complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers in the newspapers, and they'd debate them in their coffee houses and go back to their representatives.
Or beer halls.
Beer halls. Well, that would be better. No coffee. But we're smiling even at the idea of having debates about the Federalist Papers. Now, on X, you only have 20 seconds and you've moved on to a different video. So there is a real danger that things are moving so fast and people are not actually taking the time to listen to each other. But on the other hand, think of the marvelous benefits. I mean, in some ways, we live in the most incredible age in human history. All the books in the world are online. All the great music is online. It's free. All we need is to take the time to read and listen to it.
Before I let you go, you have a fair amount of exposure to educators and to the educated, the children who are coming through this and the process. Net, energized by that or discouraged?
So energized. I have the best job in the world because I get to talk to learners of all ages, starting with very young kids who are hungry to learn about the Constitution. And I'm on these Zooms with kids as early as middle school. And I'll always encourage them, you've got to read the majority opinions as well as the dissents in the Supreme Court. And this kid, chatted, I'm Bill, I'm 12, I'm not sure I can read the dissents. I'm like, I know you can do it. And they always can. Everyone rises to the occasion. And I'm seeing the same thing around America. I go to rural communities, churches, and book groups all over. And people are so hungry for deep reading and deep learning. And regardless of their politics, they're committed to the ideals of the Constitution and the Declaration. I really feel just once we get past the noise and the distractions of our polarized social media discourse and just return to first principles, I'm extremely optimistic about the future of America.
I've got one more because it just keyed on me because you mentioned churches. Help my audience understand separation of church and state, because there are those who argue what that meant is not imposing, but it didn't mean hostility. And there are those who, particularly in contemporary times, believe that it has been overused to be hostile to religion. What is our proper understanding of that?
Well, as with everything, there is a vigorous debate. There are no simple answers. And both of those positions are legitimate. The main thing that the Establishment Clause was designed to do was to prevent the establishment of a national religion, like Congregationalism in Massachusetts or Anglicanism in Virginia. No national church. But at the same time, it wasn't meant originally to disestablish the state churches, so those two things could coincide. It was more of a federalism provision. The question of how broad the free exercise of religion exemptions are was debated. Should Quakers be excused from military service? Well, back then, Congress sometimes would grant exemptions, but the courts didn't. So it's not clear that you're supposed to have a vigorous judicial enforcement of all this. There's no single right answer, but if we want a beautiful touchstone for the core meaning of the freedom of conscience, think of Madison and Jefferson in their Virginia bill against establishing religion. Madison says, because the opinions of people are dependent on evidence contemplated by their own minds, they cannot be commanded by others. In other words, I can't tell you what to think in matters of politics or religion. because that's the product of your reason, and reason can't be controlled by any other person. It's such a beautiful, shining, galvanizing Enlightenment faith. It's why we are a pluralistic society that doesn't allow the imposition of any state, church, or dogma. And working within that beautiful pluralistic framework, we can have a vigorous debate.
Always a pleasure.
Great to see you.
Love to have you here.
Thank you.